We have a bit to cover on how evolution relates to the study of animal behavior. So I'm going to break it up into a few chunks. This one is on Darwin and evolution through natural selection. Now, biology was a prerequisite for this course, so I'm guessing you guys are going to know most of this, and it'll be more of a review or a refresher than anything else. If you do feel like you're a bit rusty and it's been a little while, because I know for some of you, you might have done biology in high school, so it could have been a few years. If you feel like you could use a bit of a review on the topic of genetics, really, you just need to know the bare basics. And so the couple places I'd suggest you go, our textbook, page 39 to 40, has a little review of genetics. And actually the Wikipedia page on Mendelian inheritance is pretty good and has about the level of knowledge I would want. Honestly, a little bit more than you would need for this class, but it's pretty accessible. Is true for the concept of natural selection. We're going to be covering it in this lecture a little bit. If it feels real comfortable, if you're remembering it well, great, you're good. Our text, pages 31 to 39, also cover it, so that's giving you a little extra refresher there too. But again, if you felt like you needed a little deeper dive just because it's been a while, the Wikipedia page on natural selection, again, it's a pretty good one. So I'd recommend checking that out if you feel like you could use a little extra help. I wanted to start out by pointing out, I said Tinbergen's 4, it's going to keep coming up every time. Well, not quite every time, but quite a bit. Our topic of evolution, Tinbergen's 4, relates to Tinbergen's third and fourth question. Let's review them. Tinbergen's question number 3, survival value, also known as function. When we ask what's the function of a behavior, we're often asking, why did it evolve, right? Why is it, what about natural selection is keeping this behavior going? So we're kind of touching on it when we touch on evolution. We're often talking about function. And then of course, evolutionary history, it's in the name. If we're studying evolution, this is a piece to understand evolutionary history. So we're already starting on those ultimate factors, those longer term factors of Tinbergen's 4, right? Okay, so evolution, let's start with a basic definition. Evolution is the change in the characteristics of organisms over generations. A couple things to point out. Evolution does not work on an individual level. Instead, it's working on a species level. So species can evolve, individuals can't. Individuals can adapt, right? Adaptation and evolution do not mean the same thing. Individuals can adapt. That's what our development portion studies, right? Adaptation, change within a lifetime. Right now, we're talking about change of a population over many generations, which is evolution. I also want to point out right now, if you've come to this from a strong bio background, when you talk characteristics, you might have usually been talking about physical characteristics or physical structures. But characteristics is broader than that. All sorts of characteristics can change through evolution, including behavior. So in some cases, when we talk about the change in characteristics of organisms in this class, the characteristic we might mean is behavior, behavioral responses. Now, I'm guessing most of you are familiar with Charles Darwin. He's often referred to as the father of evolution. The reason we call him the father of evolution is not because he created it, or even because he's the first to identify it, really. It's that he proposed a process by which evolution could occur. We call that process natural selection. And also he provided a lot of scientific support for this idea of evolution through natural selection. Darwin is also a really interesting cautionary tale because Darwin came up with his theory of evolution by natural selection, had it laid out, wrote it out in papers, and a lot of his scientific friends and colleagues said, this is great, it's time to publish. Like, let's get this idea out there. But Darwin was very cautious. He said, I want to collect more data. I want to get some more evidence. One of the reasons he was cautious is because he knew this was a bit of a revolutionary idea, so it could get a lot of backlash. Also, Darwin's wife was a very religious woman, and he loved his wife very much. He was worried that there might be backlash, especially towards his wife from the church. And he knew that her faith and her church was incredibly important to her. And he was concerned about that. He was not looking for that. He also, for the record, did not feel that there was any controversy between evolution and faith. He felt that you could have both of those. You could believe in evolution and have a meaningful religious faith. He didn't think that they couldn't coexist, but he was worried some other people might. And he really just didn't want that, especially for his wife. So he kept sitting on it, kept collecting more data, kept sitting on it, kept collecting more data. And then finally, one year, he gets a paper from this guy named Watson, much younger guy. And this guy knew that Darwin had been thinking about evolution, that he was interested in it. And so Watson sends Darwin a paper. And he says, hey, I came up with this theory. I really wanted your feedback on it. I want to make sure I'm not going off the wrong end with this. And what he sent him was Darwin's theory. He came up with it, right? Darwin's not the only person who could think of this. Watson thought of it, a theory of evolution through natural selection, and he sends it to Darwin. So what Darwin does is he contacts Watson, or sorry, I keep saying Watson, it's Wallace. Oh my gosh, poor guy. Alfred Russel Wallace is his name. So Darwin contacts Wallace, and to his credit, he says, you know what, Wallace, I think you're right. I came up with this theory too, and I've got a bunch of data, scientific support to kind of back up this theory. How about you and I publish it together? We will promote the idea together, Wallace, because you and I both came up with this idea, and I've got some extra scientific support, so we'll bring it to the scientific community together. Wallace agrees, they do, and their paper on evolution by natural selection is published. Because Darwin is the more experienced scientist, he's the one who gets remembered. And Wallace do you guys know of Wallace's theory of evolution? No, we know Darwin's theory. It's okay, Wallace's name is on a bunch of other stuff. So if you're like a sciencey person who's really into this stuff, you also know Wallace. So he's not hurting too much. But it is a little bit of a cautionary tale. If you wait too long to promote your ideas because you're being too cautious, Wallace could have published this on his own. And we might have been talking about Wallace as the father of evolution, right? So I just have to give that as a little aside. So for the moment, I'm going to call it Darwin and Wallace's theory of evolution through natural selection. What did they say? What did they say it was? How did they say it works? Well, first thing, they said that there are 3 required conditions for evolution through natural selection to occur. We're going to go back to calling it Darwin's theory because, he gets the credit. What Darwin said is if you don't have all 3 of these characteristics, evolution through natural selection just cannot occur. So let's talk through all 3 of them and make sure it makes sense. First, required condition. For a characteristic to evolve, meaning for it to change in the population over generations, that characteristic must be heritable in some way. Heritable. You familiar with that word? Let's mention what that one means. Heritable simply means that the characteristic can be transmitted from parent to child. It's a trait or a characteristic that can be passed down from one generation to another. Thus, for a behavior to be heritable, it has to be more likely that the offspring of a parent who performs a particular behavior will also do that behavior. It doesn't have to be guaranteed. It just has to be more likely they will do it. Characteristic is big and broad. If you're in biology and you're studying natural selection, you're probably thinking of physical structures, things like eye color, right? We know that eye color is heritable in some way. You are more likely to share an eye color with your parents. It's somehow passed on in your genes. Some characteristics are passed on in this way, right? From parent to child, it's in your genes. Some behaviors might in fact be passed on from genes. For example, boldness versus shyness. It looks like there might be some genetic predisposition for some animals to be a little more bold in their behavior and some to be a little more shy or reserved. And it looks like that has some kind of genetic component to it. And we know this more in animals than people because we will do things like take an animal away from its parents and have it raised by somebody else. And we do see they tend to be more like their parents. But behavior can be very broad. So that's one example. Food preferences could be a heritable behavior. Mating displays could be a heritable behavior. These are kind of big, bold things, right? But it also could be more subtle behaviors. For example, maybe fish who swim a little bit faster might have offspring who swim a little bit faster. We're not talking about a whole new behavior here. All fish swim. But a subtle difference in behavior so that some swim a little more quickly, some a little more slowly. Some might swim a little higher in the water, some a little deeper towards the bottom of whatever the body of water is. These are other ways that a characteristic could be heritable. Maybe it's not a whole new behavior, it's just a subtle change in how you perform that behavior. I also need to point out that when biologists talk about heritability, they do often talk about passing something down through your genes or your DNA, right? We definitely all have talked about maybe characteristics that we've inherited from our parents, and sometimes we do mean genetics. Like I definitely look like my mom's side of the family, and there's a genetic predisposition towards certain things like blonde hair. However, we're talking behavior, and we don't necessarily mean passed down through the genes. Maybe parents are passing down a behavior by teaching it to their young, rather than having it coded in their genes. Or maybe offspring aren't even being actively taught. They just watch their parents go about their business and they pick certain characteristics up. That is still a version of heritability. It is still being passed down from one generation to another, and it is still more likely to be happening in a child if the parent also does it, right? So heritable could mean directly in your genes, but heritable can also be a learned thing. Any of those are a way to pass down a characteristic, especially when you're talking about something like behavior. Okay, why is this required for natural selection to occur? Well, this is one piece of it. Natural selection works by having certain characteristics get passed down from one generation to the next. So if the characteristic is in no way something that you could pass down from parent to child, can't have evolution through natural selection. Okay, so there's one required condition. Let's talk about the second one. This one, the wording is more confusing than I think the idea is. There has to be variation in the population on the characteristic. What this means is, whatever characteristic we're studying, individuals in that population must vary in terms of that characteristic. For example, I mentioned swimming in fish. For us to see evolution in, let's say, the speed of how quickly fish swim, some fish have to swim faster than others. That's all that means. There has to be variation in rate of swimming for us to see over generations an evolution in the rate of swimming. If everybody swims at the exact same speed, then all of their kids will swim at the exact same speed. Remember, we talked about it has to be heritable. They're all inheriting the same swimming speed. Over many generations, everybody just keeps swimming the same. But if we suddenly have one fish who swims a bit faster, it could be that he was born with a genetic mutation that makes him swim faster. It could be that somehow in his environment, he just tries to swim a little faster and he does, and it's useful. I don't know. If one fish swims a little faster, we suddenly have variation in the population. We suddenly have at least one individual in the population who varies from everybody else on that characteristic. Now, it's not a guarantee we'll see evolution, but it opens the door for the possibility. This is true for any kind of characteristic. Eye color. If every single person in the population has the same shade of brown eyes, we are not going to see evolution of eye color. Not until somebody has a different color eye. That color could be more popular and over many generations becomes more common, or it could be less popular and over generations it goes away. But until you have some kind of variation, you can't have evolution. Okay, those two of our characteristics that are required. Now let's mention our third characteristic that is required. there must be fitness consequences to having or lacking this characteristic. For us to see an evolution in a characteristic, more individuals must be born than can grow into adulthood and reproduce to their greatest capacity because of some constraint. And let me just tell you, the environment does this. Animals have constraints on them. There isn't enough food. There are dangers like predators. There aren't enough warm spots to sleep. There are limiters based on the environment, right? This is generally how the natural world works. Some animals will have a very hard time of it. For example, many insects and fish will lay tens of thousands of eggs, but only a handful of offspring will actually survive to adulthood. Even the animals that make it to adulthood, there's variation in how many of them are able to reproduce and how many of their offspring will grow into adulthood and reproduce. So a tremendous number of things determine whether an animal will survive to adulthood and reproduce. And some of these things are characteristics that the animal itself has. If these characteristics also vary across the population, and if the characteristic can be passed on to their young, then we may see evolution through natural selection occur over time. For example, I randomly mentioned speed of swimming. Let's say, and I don't know, I'm making this one up, let's say some fish are able to swim faster than others. First, for us to see an evolution in swimming speed over generations, the characteristic would have to be heritable. This could mean that genetically, if your parents were a fast swimmer, you're a fast swimmer. Or it could be a learned thing. If you're born to parents who swim fast, you learn to swim more quickly. I don't know. Either way, that would be an example of heritability. If I'm saying some fish swim faster than others, that is telling you that there is variation in the population. Some are fast and some are slow swimmers. Finally, fitness consequences. Can you think of any fitness consequence for being able to swim faster than others? The first one that comes to my mind is maybe a safety thing. Right? What's the old joke of to survive a lion attack, you don't have to be able to run faster than the lion, you just have to be able to run faster than the guy you're with? Maybe this is the same thing for fish, right? If you're out and you're swimming and you're faster than other fish, if a danger comes, you're more likely to outswim that danger than everybody else in the group. And if you outswim the danger, you are more likely to survive that encounter with a danger. If you survive it, you're more likely to be able to have young someday. So I can see that there might be fitness consequences, or a fitness benefit in this case, to being a faster swimmer. If all of these are true, that swimming faster is heritable, some fish swim faster than others, and there are some safety benefits to being able to swim fast, we might see over many, many generations more and more of those fast swimmers. That's because the fast swimming fish have more young, and either their young learn to swim fast or have the genes to be able to swim fast, and when they grow up, they can have more young, who they either, like those young, either learn to swim fast or have the genes to swim fast. We're going to see a higher and higher percentage of these fast swimmers in our population over many, many generations. This is how natural selection occurs. This is Darwin and Wallace's theory on natural selection and how it could happen. How are you feeling about that? Is this all feeling very familiar? Is this all feeling like, yep, I learned this in biology. I remember these characteristics. I kind of get that. Sort of makes sense. Feeling like review. If so, you're in great shape. You'll be reading about this in your chapter. Again, that will feel like review. The only shift might be to be thinking about the kind of characteristics we're talking about are behaviors more than they are physical structures, because this is an animal behavior course. Although sometimes you get a change in behavior because of a change in physical structures. So they can both be happening. But also this idea of heritability not having to be genetic. I remember learning about evolution, and really the talk was more about genes and how the spread of genes occurs and how that could lead to evolution through natural selection. But because we're talking behaviors, you need to remember that you can have an evolution just because you pick up traits and habits and you learn things or are taught things. And that can be a kind of evolution through natural selection as well. Okay, we're going to stop there so you can take a pause, you can think through these things, and then we're going to dive back into some more specifics about evolution as well.